Let's move on to our next speaker, Bill, dev at Spotify. Big fan of dev happiness.
I am a big fan of, well, dev happiness. That doesn't mean my happiness. I like my happiness.
Quite a buccaneer himself. He's a developer avocado, and he's here to talk to us today, and we are super thankful. So let's give a warm welcome to Bill.
Yeah. Having a slot before a break is always a dangerous territory, but I'll try my best. It's been a while since I've given a talk, but yeah, I'm excited. Thank you for having me. So yeah, I want to talk today about how Spotify is making internal documentation better, easier, and less boring. I mean, I work a lot with documentation. I've worked as a developer advocate and also built APIs, etc. So documentation has kind of been at the heart of everything I do. But to be fair, it's probably at the heart of what everyone does. We all rely on documentation, right? Cool. And this is very much around technical documentation. This is not about your vacation policies, none of that. So just to be clear. Cool, so I might as well start with introduction. Even though I was introduced, I kind of already added these. My name is Bill. I live in, well, I'll start off. I'm a software engineer at Spotify. I'm originally from Manchester, England, although my accent is kind of messed up these days. And I currently live in Stockholm, Sweden. Has anyone here been to Sweden? Okay, cool. Then you know how utopia of a country it is. It's pretty amazing. Cool. And also, I used to be a developer advocate, and I used to work a lot with Rails, which is one of the reasons why I'm here. Cool. So I want to start off and tell you a little bit about what this talk is. First of all, it's a new talk. It's the first time I've given it. It's been a while, as I mentioned, that I've given a talk, so bear with me. Second one is it's about developer experience. Hopefully, it's applicable to everyone. I'll try and put in some Ruby-related stuff as well, but yeah, it's very much general around developer experience. And also, yeah, not super specific to Ruby, so if you work with other languages, etc., this should be applicable to you as well. And then lastly, it's an opportunity to knowledge share. I think that's another reason why many people are here is like, just let's share knowledge, let's work together on these kind of things. Cool, I'll very quickly go over the structure. So I'm gonna start off with the problems. Some inspiration that we've kind of had, and maybe things that we could have used to kind of help us improve our documentation culture at Spotify. The approach we ended up taking, the impact we had, or we're having, and then some takeaways, something that hopefully you should be able to remember. If you remember something, then that to me is a success. Cool, so I'll start off with the problems. So documentation isn't exactly a new problem. I mean, since software began, we've always thought, okay, well, let's document it. Before we used to have books for one piece of software. Now we probably have just a README for many projects. But it's something that people are always thinking about. It's not a new field. I mean, isn't it supposed to be easy to create? If we think about all these different tools that we have, for Rubyus, we have Jekyll as well, even though that's not specific to documentation, that's around static sites, but and mainly a blog, actually. But the other tools are very much around documentation, but yeah, I mean, isn't that supposed to make it easier? I mean, if you look in the world of TypeScript as well, you have tools like tsdoc, where if you add annotations to your code, it generates documentation, reference documentation for you automatically. So you don't even have to write any comments or any sort of documentation, no copy and pasting. It just does it for you. Isn't it easier than ever supposed to be to publish documentation as well? I mean, if we look in the Ruby world again, it's like we have RubyDoc, and then obviously we have this, where you just copy and paste GitHub. How many people have done this with their projects? Yeah? Okay, so not so many anymore. But this used to be very popular. And of course, we have the whole world of tools as well. But these are very much designed around static websites, but we just use them for documentation as well. Which isn't a bad thing, but it's what we do today. And these address many of the public needs, the needs to brand your projects, the needs to yeah, like have fully fledged websites that explain not just how your system works or how you get started using your system. But they don't address many internal needs. And what I mean by this is things like ownership, things like what's the history behind this project. These are the kind of things that you don't really expect so much on an open source project. Maybe on the big ones like React and Rails, etc. But that I would consider them a small percentage of all the open source projects we depend on. So they don't actually address all the internal needs. And And the reasons why you do open source documentation is different to the reason you do internal. Internal, you do it because it's your job and you're paid to do it. But externally, you do it because you like open source and you want to help out with this project, and you actually have a vested interest because you can choose what you want, right? But how else doesn't it match our internal needs? I mean, we have many different places to do documentation today at Spotify. One of them is GitHub Pages. I mean, people generally internally don't want documentation websites. If you're building software internally, you want to provide documentation, but you don't want to build a whole site around it. Whereas externally, of course, I would love to do that. It's pretty easy. So I think the idea is that like they want to have documentation, and then when they open source this project, then they'll have a whole website and a bit more around it. And I think the only people internally that might do this is infrastructure teams, where they do need to sell their infrastructure internally. But for everyone else, it's really like not an interest for them. So they don't use GitHub Pages. And so in the end, we have a small percentage of software at Spotify that actually uses GitHub Pages. I think I can count like 4 that we still use today out of the many hundreds of systems we have. But then you could argue GitHub in general, right? You have READMES, you have wikis, you have all of that. And yeah, people are using that. People are writing documentation, but it's so outdated. Some documentation we have is all the way back at 2007 when Spotify was still a baby. That's not really helpful today. We've deprecated, we're long gone, but still it's there. So we end up having lots of content, but it's not actually helpful. And I think that's a problem that is slowing us down as a company. Next is Confluence, which again, for many technical people, this is clearly a no-brainer. It's not really a solution for technical documentation, but but for many companies, they're actually doing this. We already speak to other companies, and they're like, yeah, Confluence is for us. And to me, I was like, that doesn't work for developers. But it sounds so obvious, but it's not. So I wanted to clarify that. And then the next one is like, generally speaking, when it comes to a company like Spotify, when things do move very fast, and I'm sure many of you here have a similar culture in your companies, it's very hard to get the work prioritized. It's very much like build the code, and in the past we wouldn't even have tests, but then we're like, okay, let's add tests, let's make sure everything's great, but documentation will be on the last, and you'll very much have the mentality that let's do documentation later, or at least that's what we have. And it's just not working for us. And we're ending up being in this position where people have to know an entire code base to be able to contribute. And that's slowing us down a lot. And just to give you an idea, like Spotify, kind of everyone refers to us as like the company that's nailed agile. But I mean, in some ways, yes. But for us, internally, we had many different roles in the team. It was very cross-functional. If you look at this, which probably is reflective of Spotify in the early days, where we had engineers, QA, quality assurance, tech writers, and DevOps. Not every team would have a tech writer, but let's just assume for this that they do. DevOps kind of been abstracted away with Kubernetes and Google Cloud Google Cloud Engine. So we have all these abstractions away for DevOps. So you don't need DevOps really in a team anymore. Engineers just need to learn a little bit more to configure those. Same with QA. Engineers would write stuff in the past and would go, well, my job is to make stuff, not really guarantee its accuracy or its quality. And that's where QA came in. They would do your work for you. That's not really a thing anymore. TDD and all these other aspects have really changed that out. So now engineers are required to write documentation, write tests. I think a lot about documentation. And then tech writer as well, which is responsible for making sure that people know how to use your system, people are using it in the way that it's intended to. Even that's slowly moving out, but still, I think it's the last thing out of these 4 that's moving. So in the end, we end up having teams full of more engineers and less of the other roles. So we end up becoming less cross-functional and just making engineers more T-shaped. And that's kind of the culture that Spotify is going towards, and I'm sure other companies are as well. So now engineers have more responsibility, but should be more engineers. But we may end up in a future where we don't have engineers with meta-programming and software that writes software, but let's go back to 2019, let's keep it simple. But yeah, there's a lot of other issues, but I kind of highlighted the main ones, and I wanted to kind of sum them up as 3 core problems. The first one is too high of a barrier. So a lot of engineers find it difficult, surprisingly, to write good documentation, despite the fact that we read it all the time. We don't actually know what good documentation looks like for our code, which is strange. I mean, for me, I've been working with documentation so long, I feel like I have a different view on this, but this is what we've been seeing from engineers. Second one is undiscoverable. I think this is something we very much take for granted with Google. We just copy and paste our error codes, we get our answer. Internally, it's a different story. If your company operates entirely open source, this whole talk is probably not applicable to you, but most companies don't. So, and if we think about the first two as, the first one being creating documentation, the second one around consuming it, the third one has to be maintaining it. And one thing we've seen is we define it as trust, right? If you're reading documentation, how much do you trust it? Does it answer the problem you're having? Is it going to take more time away from you? And kind of all these three problems end up with a poor and slow developer experience. And this is something that, for me personally, I don't like. I like engineers to be very fast and very efficient and just have less frustrations, really. So yeah, in 2019, Spotify is trying to solve this problem. It's something that, in general, Spotify is trying to make engineers more effective is the right word. More productive means more hours, so we don't want that. But we want engineers to be more effective. So we kind of pitched the idea of like solving this and trying to bring out some good engineers to solve this, and as well as tech writers. And yeah, we're doing it, and we've been doing it for 6 months, and I want to share our learnings, and hopefully, if you have anything that you're doing in your company, we can definitely learn from you as well. So yeah, when we were thinking about this 6 months ago, we were talking a lot about, can we not just use another tool? We don't want to necessarily write software, despite the fact I like writing software. The more product aspect of my mind thinks that's the last solution. I mean, the first one is obviously, why don't we just enhance our use of GitHub, right? And make this better, maybe with better tooling, using the APIs, etc. And this is something we battled a lot against, because GitHub is a great tool, but the one thing it does really well that we ended up taking out of it was that it's, if you look at the README, it's always close to the code, right? And this is how I think about tests. If your tests were in a different repository to your code, you'd probably almost never update your tests, or it'd be a lot less likely. But the same thing applies to documentation. Some people have their documentation in a separate repo, or in, I don't know, Slack notes or Google Docs or somewhere else. But having it close to the code, I think is pretty great. So that's something we took from it. But the reason why we didn't end up using it was that we just weren't able to like experiment enough with it. For example, we wanted to solve the idea of trust and maintainability, and that was the one area where we didn't really, we struggled to find here. But that being said, I still think we could end up moving back to GitHub. This isn't like, oh, GitHub will never solve our needs, just for now, really. Next one is library. Has anyone heard of library? It's an open source project. Okay, so this one was fairly recently released, and this one was actually pretty interesting, because what it does is it takes Google Docs, and you put them in a shared folder, and you can just search for it. It kind of just categorizes it automatically. This isn't really helpful for technical, or rather API documentation, but if you think about RFCs and these kind of stuff are very popular in companies, and rightfully so. How do we like take the great things out of this and apply it to what we're doing? But the one caveat with this is that documentation is not close to the code. Should RFCs be closer to the code? Should they be closer to like the projects that you're working with, or what it's related to? Next is a tool called README, and many people use this, and many teams use this, but this is very much designed for an outwards-facing product team. Like, I used to work on developer@spotify.com, and this was a perfect candidate for this, because we kind of collect all the tooling around internally at Spotify, and we make it available to developers. But we're that one team. Internally, there is no one team. Every team has their software, has their documentation. So this didn't really solve our needs either. And I wanted to bring up this quote, and I think it's so true. Documentation is a love letter to your future self. But I want to like amend this quote and say that good documentation is a love letter to yourself. Bad documentation is a hate letter to your future self. But it's true. It's very much true. So yeah, with that, what is Spotify's approach to this problem? We're not trying to be necessarily radical. We just want to solve this problem. Has anyone heard of docs like code? No? Okay. So docs like code is created by this lady, or popularized by this lady called Anne Gentle. It's a really interesting book. but it talks about like how not just having documentation in the same repository as your code, but actually thinking of it like code, having parts of it that are automated, parts of it that are generated, testing the code samples, very much making it part of the developer workflow. And I think when we think of it like that, when we edit code related to it, we'll probably edit the documentation as well. And this is a cultural thing that that will happen, or something that we're trying to push out as well. And Google gave a great talk about this, and how they've been adopting this mentality, and they use a tool internally called G3 Docs. And yeah, it's working very well for them. So with that, it kind of inspired us to build on this idea, and then we ended up building this tool. It was called Tech Docs. Very unoriginal for Spotify, please forgive me. Technical documentation, Tech Docs, but we had to think of a name fast. And it's pretty simple. Internally at Spotify, we have a centralized tool called Backstage, very, very applicable to music. And then we basically have this tool where documentation lives inside of it, /docs/ the project name. And we use open source projects for this, so it's not entirely, we haven't built this whole thing. And then the other aspect which you may see here is this right-hand bar, or the box, or I haven't given it an official name, but any suggestions would be welcome. And it's very much integrated with Spotify's software ecosystem. It's very well connected to GitHub, how many issues are related to documentation. We scan the issues and we detect which ones are documentation related versus code related. Who are the people you can contact related to support, which team owns it, when was it last updated. And we want to evolve this kind of experience to get people to like see this very much how you see code. If you think about Git blame and all these different workflows as well. But why build our own solution? Why even do this? Why not just, why was it worth the effort to even try this? Well, I mean, in reality, we mostly didn't. We used mkdocs, Docker, our internal CI platform, Google Cloud, Kubernetes, and we built this whole thing in a week. And we basically been spending all of our time with data rather than actually with web. But it's still very interesting, and there's a lot of web-related aspects to this. I mean, this is a very much a high-level view of how the system works. I mean, when you're writing your docs code, your docs folder with your markdown, you just push your code normally, and in our internal CI platform just checks, is there a docs folder? If so, run our code. And then it uploads it to Google Cloud Storage, your rendered site. And then we basically read out from that, and then we add some injection, but very basic injection. And we've optimized this so engineers can actually access our Google Cloud Storage bucket without the need of our proxy. So every engineer at Spotify has access to our GCS bucket, and they can just read the documentation straight off the bat. So we're almost abstracting away the need for the proxy, but it's still there as for now, and it's something we want to try out and see how that works, especially for non-engineers and data scientists, etc. So yeah, we want to evolve and experiment with documentation. We want to make it constantly available. We want to make it very informative. We want engineers to know and people to know how, within seconds, if this will solve your problem, especially in a company like Spotify where this changes daily. And here's a little bit about how we thought about it and how we are thinking about it. I mean, if we think about it in these two areas, standards being more of a cultural thing, like how do we make engineers think about documentation as code? And then the workflow, which is a mixture of tooling and integrations and those kind of things. And the problems I mentioned earlier about too high of a barrier, undiscoverable, and untrustworthy, how can we use standards and workflow to solve these problems? Hopefully that's not too confusing, but so let's break that down a little bit actually. So with standards, using that to solve too high of a barrier, we introduced this idea of two documentation types at Spotify. Code, which is not a new type. It's very much how you use it today. You have a docs folder and you have code. But system documentation is a fairly new thing and something that we realize not many other companies do. And just to give you a quick explanation of how this works, we have our web API. If many of you have used the Spotify web API, each part of the web API is split out into its own service. We have web API users, tracks, albums, and many more. And these are operated as code docs. They have the code and they run in production, and they have a docs folder, and that describes that particular system. But we have nothing that describes all of web API, general things like authentication, all those things. And that's where we have the idea of system documentation, where this is a repository, a GitHub repository, just has a docs folder, no code, could do in the future. and it operates as a system doc or system documentation. And this works very well for us, and a lot of people are using this. And then we can use how they're linking out to these other ones to build up a graph of how documentation lives at Spotify. And using standards as well to solve discoverability. This is simple. Telling people to document concepts. You'll be surprised how many people don't do this. If you mention GCS or GKE or API in your code, if you don't describe what API is, you don't have to write a full book on it, but just link out to it, say, check out this particular this link to read more about it. Having references to the concepts you use in your code is pretty critical, because otherwise you're asking engineers to Google more, rather than like just taking them straight to the answer. And that makes people slower. Even more so if they don't find what they're looking for. And the next one, the next one is documenting error messages. So this is like a very good example. There's so many times that we have error codes, and they don't explain what it is that we are, what it means. So having these documented is pretty great. And the next one is suits the Command F workflow. So many developers look at documentation, and the first thing they do is Command F, because they want an instant answer. And we've done a lot of research around this. And basically the answer to this is don't segment docs too much. Don't make documentation really small. Make it not too big either. You want to separate them out so people can navigate, but not too small where people can't Command F. So guiding people that way with standards as well. And here's a very applicable example with Sorbet. They have a list of all the error codes, and then with descriptions with them. This is great. Just a good example there. Using standards to solve untrustworthiness. These two are, first one is documentation promotes inclusion. If you think about imposter syndrome, documentation is the answer to, a part of the answer at least, to solve this, making it easier for people to self-serve and be able to work with your code without having to ask people. That's a really important part of it for us. Second one is documentation is a part of tech health. It's something that we should think about when we think about systems that are hard to maintain. It's because we don't understand them, because documentation isn't good. So I've only got a few minutes, so I'll kind of rush through these. But using workflow to solve too high of a barrier, this is simple. We provide tooling for skeleton documentation. This is not anything new or radical. You have this as well externally. Previewing documentation, if I go back to treating docs like code, this is very much applicable to that, and we have tooling for that. This is a more interesting one, is continuous documentation. I'm thinking about documentation as this. To me, the idea of continuous integration, continuous deployment, is that your master branch is reflective of reality. And I think if we think about that with documentation, we'll always try our best to make sure it's reflective of the reality of the code base, not things that are outdated. So having a continuous documentation mindset is and this is as simple as just making things update instantly, giving that impression that it is continuous. Friendly to power users. Internally, we have this domain hack, I guess. You type in docs, and it takes you straight to our documentation. And you can type in question mark, we hijack the query params, and we use that as a search query. So anyone at Spotify can do docs question mark on-call policy, and they can find all the on-call policies in the company. If you want to find out just specifically in architecture, you just do docs/architecture, and they'll search for MySQL inside of architecture. So it needs to work for power users as well, because they're the ones who are typically maintaining the most important systems in the company. GitHub workflow integration. So this one is very much around if we think about opening issues and PRs to make changes to documentation. Yeah, I mean, not everyone uses GitHub issues though. People use Jira. So we can't make it necessarily use GitHub issues, but everyone uses pull requests. So instead of the idea of creating an issue, we're about people can create suggestions and changes, shifting to a culture where every team at Spotify can benefit from this rather than asking everyone to move to GitHub issues. And this is an example of how it works internally. You just highlight text, give feedback, open a GitHub issue. But we want to change that and make that work for pull requests instead. Workflow to solve discoverability. There's only two here, but one is we use Cloud Search. This is a new tool that we've just started using. Highly recommend it if you're considering it internally. This one is simple. It's making sure that the culture that we have externally of like Googling things, constantly searching error messages, we want to bring that internally as well. So we have Stack Overflow Enterprise internally, we have this tech docs internally, and we want to basically give that culture. And this is our way of doing that. Next is predictable URLs, which is pretty straightforward. Just making things predictable. Engineers love predictable URLs. And then the last part to this is solving trustworthiness. And this one is the more interesting approach that we're trying out. And we're using a lot of data, and we're trying to gather data to calculate documentation trust. If documentation belongs to the code, we can see how often you're updating the code base, how often are you updating the documentation, how often are you responding to feedback. How can we use this to build quantifiable metrics that teams can then say, okay, well, our documentation is not that good, it's at 60%. Because right now, engineers don't know how good or bad their documentation is. I mean, they can have an instinct, but that's about it. So how can we do this? And this is kind of how we're thinking about it. It's like when you're testing your documentation, or you're running a test, or you're calculating trust, come up with issues and raise them and bring the right issues. And this is a really complex problem if you think about it, because content is text. And if we think about the talk yesterday, it's not easy to decipher it always. So yeah, very quickly, what impact have we made? We have 6 people on our team. We're very cross-functional. We use a mixture of tech writers to shape culture and engineers to build tooling. We have 400 services, so I think around half of Spotify is using this already in 6 months, which is a pretty big deal. We have many thousands of engineers. And one metric we're using is page views to kind of calculate, are people find this valuable? People keep navigating around documentation. And then we want to evolve that. How often are people using Command F and finding what they're looking for? All these things. We want to build these metrics out. And this is an interesting quote I wanted to just quickly highlight, is a team was using it to, was moving to tech docs, and they realized that a lot more people are using their documentation. Or a lot more people are contributing to it as well, because it ties into their workflow. They know how GitHub issue works. With Jira, they might think it's a bit foreign, all these things. And they're seeing great success with it. And this is one of the most important teams at Spotify, moving forward at least. And this is kind of a growth curve of how documentation has shifted at Spotify. And it's slow. It's not a hockey stick growth, but the barrier to entry for documentation is higher. People have to move from Google Docs. They have to move Markdown from another place. It's not like signing up for Spotify where you just get it straight away and that's it. You're considered a metric. So just quickly wrap up. What are some 3 takeaways? One is we want to use documentation to make it better for inclusion. We want people who come into Spotify to be able to self-serve, to be able to operate independently. And then when they feel confident to be able to ask a question that they know might not sound like a stupid question, then they have the tools to do that. Of course, we don't have this culture of like, there's no bad question, but still people feel that way, so we want to empower them. Second is we want to make it easy to prioritize for product managers and for teams. We want them to see that their documentation is a point where they need to address it. And this will build a culture where we can move faster. And then lastly, making it less boring for engineers by giving them, by also through these metrics, but also tying it into their workflow, not giving them new tools to learn, just something that works for them already. Cool, and that's my talk, and thank you so much for listening.
So, Bill, thank you so much. I'm a big fan of documentation myself. The most important one being, of course, X marks the spot. But never let it be said we're not selfish. Here's some of our booty that we found.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.